All right, so viewpoint intents. This is going to maybe be surprisingly important to some of you, meaning that it's something you may not have thought a lot about, but is one of the most important aspects of transitioning from amateur to pro. And learning how to control your viewpoint intents and make it work for you will elevate you very quickly above the rest of the writers. This is one of those things. I've talked about other ones before, but this is one of those things that the editors and the reader can tell in like the first 5 paragraphs, like the pianist and the metaphor I gave you. You could tell the difference between a pianist who practiced for 20 years and one who practiced for 2 years. You could tell in a matter of minutes. For writing, the stuff that you see on the first page, the things that are going to jump out at an editor or reader are how well you manage your learning curve and your info dumps, which we talked about last time I was here, and how well you manage your viewpoint intents. Because those are the things you can really get in a few paragraphs that really jump out at you. Let's talk first about the viewpoints, and then we'll talk about the tenses and what they do for you and how you can use them as tools. There are 2 main tenses, or 2 main viewpoint types used in fiction today. Can anyone tell me what they are?
First and third person.
Which third?
Limited, I guess.
Third, limited, and first person are your defaults. And third. We'll talk about the weird ones as well. So you have them as arrows in your proverbial quiver. But those are arrows that should be rarely used, okay? We'll talk about how to do these well. First can actually be, there's several different breakdowns in first, and we'll talk about it. The most common is actually, I've had to define these myself just so I can understand them. These are not standard definitions. Someone else will have standard definitions. But is kind of like the movie camera. First. This is the first person that you get the impression that even though they're telling you the story, they're telling it to you as it happens, not after the fact. It's not a flashback. If you want an example of a story that does this well, go read Uglies by Scott Westerfeld. An excellent example of something that uses the first person, kind of the movie camera. I don't know how else to explain it, but it's not like, some first person, which is the reflection. First person. This is the first person, and if you watch my lecture last year, I probably have different definitions for these. I just have them grouped in my head, so don't treat these as like, but this is the one where you get a first person, something like, has anyone here read Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb? Excellent book, brilliant use of first person. It's a reflective first person. Another one of these is Name of the Wind by Pat Rothfuss. These are the first person that you get the sense that the person is actually telling the story to you at some future point, and it's going into kind of this flashback first person.
Moon is a harsh mistress.
Yeah. These are the 2 main ones. There is kind of another one that I see used very rarely, and this is the storyteller. And this one blends into a third omniscient. This is the kind of where you have a storyteller who's telling you a story and they reference themselves as I. They may not even be a character in the story, but they're telling it to you. And so it's kind of a blending between this. This was actually fairly popular in the older days. You don't see it as much anymore. I can't even think of a really good example of this. Chronicles of Narnia. Okay, yeah. And The Hobbit kind of feels like this, though I don't know if he ever uses the first for it. I think The Hobbit is just true third omniscient.
The Book Thief?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So yeah.
Every single Redwall novel?
I haven't read Redwall. I know, I feel like a doofus that I haven't read Redwall, but we will use that as an example that, so yeah. But you've got this sort of thing. It's used much more rarely, but it is kind of this blending between the two, and it's actually one of the ways that third omniscient does work, that I've seen it work. So these are your your different breakdowns there. We'll talk about what each of them do. I will mention that this is kind of, I've found it's hard because I don't read enough. I do read in the genre, but I don't read enough to tell. It feels like this has become the default in YA recently.
At least first person using the eye.
Yeah, first
For
person,
the
definitely.
teenagers.
Either one of these two, but it feels like this one's kind of taken over a bit. Like, you don't get the sense that this is happening, that someone's sitting after the adventure and telling it to you. You feel like you're getting almost a stream of consciousness formed into a first person as it's happening. All right? So keep that in mind if you're writing YA, that this is the kind of the default. It doesn't mean you have to do it, but it is something that's very popular in the genre right now. So third limited is your basic third-person viewpoint. Third, you could say, is split between limited and omniscient, but they're so different that you really want to kind of think of them as two different viewpoints. Third limited is where a given scene is from a single character's viewpoint, and in that scene, you describe everything through that character's lens, so to speak. Okay? And so if they can't see something, then you can't describe it through sight. For instance, if you're in my viewpoint and the door slams, you say you heard a door slam. You can say a door slammed, but you don't show the door slamming. You show him hearing it, or you talk about him hearing it. You don't want to, of course you want to use shows rather than tells, but you also don't want to imply things happening off stage that the character can't see. You also stay away from information the character doesn't know. And when you give a description, you try to give a description through the character's eyes and their lens so that you are giving characterization at the same time. This kind of blends into the lecture we had last time, where we talked about info dumps and how really awesome storytelling is going to do your info dump by way of the character. Well, this is an extrapolation on that, okay? So, the tenses are basically past and present, and freaky future. That's your freaky one that you're only allowed to use if you take an experimental writing class or if you want to get published in like some experimental magazine or something like that. I suppose there could be uses for it otherwise, but you really, stay away from this one. It's scary. Stay away particularly from second person future tense. Because that's the freaky one down here, second person.
Is this the second person, like, giving instructions?
Yeah, it's choose your own adventure books are in second person. And there are some very experimental stories that can do cool things with second person. The thing about them is it kind of just gets old after like 2,000 words, unless it's like in a choose your own adventure or something, which is why you got to be really careful with both second person and future. Past and present, surprisingly, are surprisingly similar. If you're used to one, the other one will jar you for a little while, and then your mind will switch over, and by the time you're about a third of the way through the book, you won't be noticing anymore, is what we find. That said, there are some people who really feel that present is more immediate, and past is less immediate, so they love present. That said, past is the default for a lot of the mainstream adult science fiction and fantasy. YA is split between present and past right now. I would say that if you go into a bookstore and randomly pick up a popular YA book, there's a pretty good chance it's this first person in the present tense. But it switches between the two. You'll find everything in YA. So, do you guys know the difference between these two? Is there anyone who don't feel embarrassed, who is confused by the idea of past versus present tense? Okay? Yes. Okay. So, with past versus present tense, you want to probably default to past tense. He went to the store and picked up a bag of groceries, rather than saying he goes to the store and picks up a bag of groceries in your narrative. Stick to saying everything in the past tense and stay very far away from present tense, even if it gets kind of tricky if you're writing in the first person. and it's still the case, and you're writing like this one, this gets really problematic. Because, for instance, if I say, I was a detective on the streets of Chicago. My best friend was Willie. Willie is a, because he still is. Does that make sense? You've got this sort of weird transition thing where you can transition into present tense because Willie is still your best friend and he's still this. I would suggest staying away from that and just sticking completely to past tense. If this sort of thing is confusing for you, or if it's just go ahead. You will never go wrong writing everything in past tense. Even say Willie was a, because it's all taking place in the past, and you don't have to worry about present. Okay.
Have you ever read a third-person present?
Third-person present, yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
First book of the Recluse series is third-person present. So if you go pick that up and you want to see, it's by Lee Modesitt. L.E. Modesitt Jr., I guess, is how I should say it, because we're on camera. I should say it properly. Lee's a good guy, and I think the first book is in present tense. You see it a lot more in the past, because once science fiction, fantasy, science fiction and fantasy as genres are relatively new. The novel as a genre is relatively new. But you've got sci-fi books taking off in the golden age, really in the 30s and 40s and things like that. And then fantasy really is starting to establish itself in the 60s and 70s. That's like just a blink of time when it comes to storytelling and things like that. And so it took a while before we really settled on what it is we do. And this could all shift. Maybe across the next 20 years, everything will shift back to going to present tense. Who knows? But you'll find you'll find things different in older books. For instance, a lot of the older books are not as strict on viewpoint as newer ones are. For instance, if you go back and read the original Ender's Game, I think he's actually updated it and changed some of the tense things. But you would occasionally slip into Bean's tense just for no reason, and you'd have 2 paragraphs of Bean and things like that because it wasn't as standardized back then. And nowadays, if you pick up one of Scott Card's books, every time there's a viewpoint shift, there's a line break, and you shift to someone else's scene. You give an indication. We are now swapping heads, and that's what we do right now. You give a line break, and in your manuscript, you just put a pound sign alone on its own line, center it. And that means line break, and then really your trick right here, so you've got your text. In this first sentence or two, you want to establish whose viewpoint we've moved to. And if it's a new character, the first character mentioned, people are going to default to assuming that's the viewpoint unless you can jar us out of it very quickly. So that's how you do third person limited, is you do a line break or a chapter break to switch to a new character. Tad Williams is very good at this. If you go read some of his books, he's very good at viewpoint shifts. Robert Jordan did it quite extensively, and I think he was a master of the third person limited, despite starting each book with a paragraph of omniscience. So let's talk about. You now know what limited is. At least you've got a handle on it. Does everyone have a handle on what first and third limited are? Any questions about that? You know what they are. We'll talk about what they do in a few minutes. Omniscient is this weird beast where you are in everyone's head at the same time. This is easiest if you're doing the storyteller, right? An omniscient with the storyteller, without even sometimes the first person perspective. I mentioned The Hobbit. It's like this. It is hardest to do in the true omniscient style, which is basically every paragraph is a new viewpoint. And you're going to show everyone's thoughts in the same scene, and you're not going to withhold any of them. I feel that the master of this was Frank Herbert, and Dune is the great science fiction fantasy omniscient book. And if you want to learn how to write omniscient, you should probably look at Dune. One thing you'll notice that he does with omniscient is he doesn't withhold any information. If someone walks on stage with the other characters and they are secretly a traitor, they think, well, I'm so sad I have to betray these people. You see immediately what's going to happen. He does not hide secrets from you. He shows what everyone's thinking and feeling, to the point that David Lynch, when he made the movie, decided to give everybody voiceovers so you could get the omniscient viewpoint, and it was really creepy. But I'm very fond of that movie. You guys seen the old movie?
Yeah.
Sting's in the
Love
movie,
it.
and in what, like black leather or something like that?
And every
Spandex?
time before he comes on the
Beautiful
screen, there's like a wailing
Yeah.
guitar.
It's got Patrick Stewart in it as Gurney. It's got Patrick Stewart with a mullet. I mean, come on. It's actually a very fine movie, but it does weird things like that. And one of them is they try to convey the omniscient viewpoint of the books by having people's thoughts as you zoom in on them. It is very hard to do. Very hard. I would recommend you not do it except as experimenting unless it's something you're passionate about. If it's something you're passionate about, go for it. But understand, this is really hard, and you may want to practice with this or this first. All right? Keep that in mind. But we will talk about how to do omniscient as well. So,